Okay, so it's lesson 10, and today we're going to start tackling unit testing in a .NET environment. We need to know how to do this so we can incorporate it into our assignment 2 weeks. So I think probably pretty much everybody in here has done some unit testing before. What can you tell me about unit testing? What do you remember about it from what you've done so far? Ron?
You try to instantiate your object.
Yep.
Look if it gives you an error, it gives you an expected value.
Okay. Okay, so that's part of it, right? We have certain expectations and we're checking whether those expectations are met or not.
Just from what I saw, we're supposed to do on part 2 of this assignment, my understanding of unit testing is just to create some test data, choosing a controller in the project, and then just running through each method with the test data to make sure that all those methods work as intended.
Okay, right. So in an MVC environment, our main testing is going through controller by controller and testing that all of the methods, we test each of them in a controller and make sure that we get the expected response. Anything else you remember about unit testing when you've done it before? Okay, yep. So what kinds of things in a model might you want to test? Okay, so we can test things like data types and validation rules in our model to make sure that when those rules aren't followed, that we get expected behaviors. Anything else at all you remember from unit testing? Which course did you guys do unit testing in? Java. And what framework did you use for unit testing? Use JUnit? And is there any kind of metric to tell you about code coverage when you're working with JUnit? Sorry? Okay, and so what does that do for you? Like, what's the purpose of that? Okay. Right, okay, all right. So unit testing, I mean, you've done it in a Java environment, but unit testing frameworks exist in pretty much any kind of programming framework. So Microsoft has their own, works similar to Java, but it's built right into Visual Studio. There are some other third-party unit testing tools. If we're working in something like JavaScript, there's suites for unit testing JavaScript. So unit testing is kind of important at two different parts in building an application. What would be the two different stages where we want to do unit testing? We don't just do it once, we typically do it twice. When would you want to unit test? Okay, so after we're done kind of building the application, right, before it can go into production, that's a good time to run all our unit tests before we launch it and have our customers reporting errors, right? Unit testing is designed to show us some of those problems so we can catch and fix them. When else would you want to do unit testing?
All throughout the development process, just to make sure any new code or whatever you've added to the application hasn't broken anything.
Right, that's the other time, would be post-production when we're doing maintenance. Whenever we're making changes or adding new features, we want to make sure adding or changing A doesn't break B. Common problem. We add something new, either we fix a bug over here or we add a new feature, and that winds up now breaking something that worked previously. So unit testing is designed for us to catch those problems. When we make changes, run and retest our original code. Okay. So here's basically what we're doing. We're going to start with a basic unit test. We're going to start with a basic unit test. We're going to start with a basic unit test. We're going to start with a basic unit test. We're going to start with a basic unit test. We're going to start with a basic unit test. We're going to start with a basic unit test. We're going to start with a basic unit test. We're going to start with a basic unit test. We're going to start with a basic unit test. We're going to start with a basic unit test. We're going to start with a basic unit test. We're going to start with a basic unit test. We're going to start with a basic unit test. We're going to start with a basic unit test. We're going to start with a basic unit test. We're going to start with a basic unit test. We're going to start with a basic unit test. We're going to start with a basic unit test. We're going to start with a basic unit test. We're going to start with a basic unit test. We're going to start with a basic unit Start my machine because this is getting a little unwieldy. So we're unit testing very specific pieces of code. We're not testing massive at once. A unit test is testing one function. Pretty easy in an MVC environment because typically a unit test can run on a method. We may be checking multiple outcomes. So one method there. So I think right now in our .NET MVC controllers, we have, I think, roughly 8 or 10 methods. To fully unit, you need a couple dozen tests to test all of the different execution paths. So what we're going to do is we're going to unit test one controller in our music store. And in order to do all this, a couple of classes to do. So I've put up a couple references here. So this is actually a really good tutorial series, a few years old now. I'm not going to walk you through the whole thing, but this is from Visual Studio Magazine. So what we're going to do in here, so this is a 4-part tutorial where they set up a brand new .NET MVC application from scratch, and then they explain how to unit test it. So I've borrowed some of what's in here, but the links are here if you want to check it out. The other thing I've borrowed, so what we're going to do is kind of a hybrid of this tutorial series along with, this is a 50-minute video, which I'm not going to play for you, but the link is here. This guy does a really good job explaining .NET unit testing. Again, it's a few years old now, so a few things have been updated. So what we're going to do in the music store is kind of a hybrid of that tutorial series and this video demo. That's about 50 minutes. But these are here for your reference if you want to check either of them out. If you prefer either of those instructors to me, well, they're for you. Okay? So those links are here. We're also going to use this framework for working with mock in-memory data. Because one of the things we need to do when we unit test is we need to divorce our application from the database. When we're working with a database and testing, that's not really unit testing. Why not? Okay, we generally do use test data, but why? What kind of test is it if we're testing how our application interacts with the database? That wouldn't be considered unit testing, it'd be considered some other kind of testing. What would you call that? Yeah, that would be integration testing, right? Because we have two different components. We've got our application and we have our database. So when we're working together, we're testing how are those things communicating and are they communicating properly? So to do proper unit testing, to divorce the database from our application. So we're testing our methods, but we're testing them with data that's just in memory. We're not actually going out and connecting to the database. We're kind of temporarily severing off the database from the application. So we'll kind of look at how this is going to work. I've actually taken a few screen captures from this video and thrown up a few slides, which I have here. Not very many, there's only 4 or 5 to kind of give you an idea of where we're going with all of this. So we want to open up our music store and go through the process of actually starting to refactor this. So I'm going to open up my project and launch it. Please excuse all the flickering. I may have to, when we take a break, try and downgrade my driver, my graphics driver. Okay. So here's our app. So we're not really actually changing. We're not adding functionality to this. We want to keep the music store, but we want to start the unit test. So we have some tools here to do it. And you might remember at the time we actually set the project up, there was a checkbox for enabling unit testing in September. And I said when we created the project, we were going to check that off because we knew eventually we wanted to do unit testing. And I asked you to do the same thing in your assignment. So this is why our solution actually shows two projects. The main project is our web project, and it's considered the startup project, which is why it's in bold. But down below, we actually also got a secondary project, which has the same name as our solution, but it's called tests. So we actually have a few unit tests in here already. So if you look in here, notice there's no web.config because this isn't a web application. The configuration file is actually called big. And in here, there's a folder. And just like Visual Studio, when we scaffolded out our MVC app, it created the home controller with index, about, and contact methods. When we pick unit tests, it actually scaffolds a home controller test class. So let's have a look at what's here. So I'm going to open up the home controller in my web project. So we modified a little bit. We modified this just a little bit back in week 1. But in the home controller in the web project, we had 3 methods with index, about, and contact. And we played around with the view bag and changing the message. We just looked at how our controllers loaded a view. So we had these 3 methods. So our test has a few different references at the top. Right? It references the Visual Studio unit testing namespace. And it also references the controller namespace of the web project. So this way, this file can unit test any controller methods in the project. So all this stuff is set up automatically as soon as we check that box in our project setup. So our class gets this decorator, right? That it indicates the purpose of this class is simply for unit testing. And by convention, the controller name matches our controller name here, but it has the word test on the end. So we have 3 test methods, one called index, one called about, and one called contact. So Visual Studio automatically generated a unit test for each of those 3 methods. So each test method, you'll notice certain things in common. It has this test method decorator. Again, not functional code, it's simply used for unit testing. And all of them, all our unit tests take have the same structure. We can basically go through 3 steps in running a unit test. Again, this isn't .NET specific. This is true of Java, JavaScript, Ruby, anything else. Right? We've got arrange, act, and assert. And you've probably seen these same constructs in Java. What do those things mean? You can see the when my screen's not flashing. Arrange, act, and assert. What do each of those mean in kind of everyday language? What's arrange, what's act, what's assert? Okay, so arrange is basically setting things up. So it's initializing, in this case, the controller. It could also be any other variables we need to set up. So for example, later on when we're using mock data, that'll be part of our arrange. Right? So it's the setup. What do we need in order to run this unit test? What's happening in the act part? Mark?
That's where we encoded is
the method or the model that we want to test. And then what's happening in the assert? Ron, I'll ask you because this comes back to what you had described in unit tests earlier. Right, it's what are we expecting to get and does our unit test return what it should? The result that we get. So there's our assert. So you'll notice every one of these has those same 3 comments. Do this for almost all of our unit tests, right? This is kind of the format. I assume it's the same. I haven't worked with JUnit personally. I assume it has the same structure when you use JUnit. Yes, no, maybe. Different? What was it like in Java? They don't use those terms? All right. So we've got 3 tests here. So if we want to run these tests, a few ways we can do it. As like with many things in Visual Studio, there's many different ways of running the same thing. So the first thing we can do is I could just right-click my controller method, and I could run, if I click Run Test from the context menu, it's going to invoke Visual Studio's own unit testing framework. So I'll click Run Test. And it tells me no test found. Okay, if we want to run an individual test, I wonder if we can do it here. We'll try it on an individual test. No? Okay. Oh, there. So now, Test Explorer window popping open. So it ran my index, and it gives me a green check mark telling me that test passed. These 2 are blue because they haven't run. For all the unit tests, I can just click Run All. Okay, so my index and contact tests passed. If I want to see the error here, so my about unit test failed because the unit test expected the content, your application description page, right? This was the pre-built unit test. This is what it expected. And this is the default content in the about method when we scaffold out our site. But controller, we actually changed this code back in week 1 or week 2 to display a different message. So in this case, our test, what we expect to get is what gets returned. So one of the other nice things, and again, you may have seen this in Java, is now if I look at my home controller, once we run the tests, Visual Studio will show me, here's how many unit tests there are for this method, and here's the results. So it tells me that there's actually 1 unit test calling this method, and when we tried running it, this unit test failed. So there's 2 ways we could get our test to pass. What change could we make? And I would say one is a better idea than the other. What could we do to get our about test to pass? Okay, so we could change the test case. So how would we change it? Right, so if we change the result that we're expecting, we can then just run this test again. I need to run them all. So now it'll rebuild, and now we're asserting that the view bag message says this is the about page. So our goal when we're writing unit tests is we want all our unit tests to pass. So we can assert here, we can basically see 2 different assertions. In the about method, what we're actually testing is the message in the view bag. So we can assert that 2 different values are equal. We want to check that we do get X. We can also assert, for example, in the index method, here we're just checking that when we call the index method, we get a view returned to us. So we can assert that the method result isn't null. So we can see all of the assert methods. We can check that things are equal or not equal. We can check that they're null or not null. Check for an exception, right? Maybe we're performing math and we might have a 0 passed in and we're dividing, right? In that case, we would expect, if we check that method, to throw an exception. So we also want to check when we're doing error handling that when errors happen, our application throws the right kinds of errors. So our test explorer, we're probably going to leave this open. This is kind of useful. So now it shows our test pass. And now it says that we've had 1 of 1. So the unit test that before showed 0 of 1 with a red X, it now shows 1 of 1. 1 unit test on this method, and now when we execute it, it passes. So one of the other testing tools we want to use up here is inside of the test menu. Now, most of you will have this, but if anybody's using Visual Studio Community Edition, you won't have the code coverage tool by default. You have to install it as a Visual Studio extension. So the way you can check, if you click on Test and Analyze Code Coverage, if you don't have this option, you probably have Visual Studio Community. The other way you can check is if you go to Help, it'll show you right here which version you have. If it says you have the Community Edition, I think the Community Edition doesn't include the code coverage tool. Is there anybody that has the Community Edition? Okay. Do you have the code coverage? Okay. I think here's how you can get it. If you go to Tools and Extensions and click Online over here, I think if you click Code Coverage, I believe the extension, it doesn't show up for it installed in the enterprise, but have a look for code coverage. There may be an install. If you don't see that, we'll have to do a little searching online. So here's how code coverage works. If I click Test Coverage and choose All Tests, it first runs all my tests again, but then it says, so, okay, overall on our 97.2% is not covered. So most of our code is not covered by unit tests, but there is just 2 and a bit percent that are. So if I look in my controllers and go down to the home controller, so within our home controller, 84% of the code is covered. So so we can see, for example, we wrote an FAQ method in the controller, but we don't have a unit test. So it says there's 3 blocks of code here, but we have no unit tests for those. The other feature this has, if I click this button here, the second last one that says Show Code Coverage Coloring, if I turn that on, me in my controller. So the areas that are blue, those are covered by unit tests. The areas that are yellow are partly covered. And if it has a red background, like on FAQ, there's no unit test at all. So we can increase our code coverage by simply writing a unit test for our FAQ method. Returns a view. So if we add another unit test, we can then rerun this tool. Unfortunately, there's no refresh, which is super annoying. We actually have to run the whole. But let's try this. So we're going to write a test method here. So we'll go back to our controller. We'll method. Test FAQ. The first thing we'll do is our arrange will instantiate an instance of our controller. Now I know we're doing this same thing over and over again. Every one of these tests instantiates an instance of the home controller. Our test classes, they do contain a test initialize method. So we could move this code later to the test initialize method, and then it will automatically run before every unit test. So that's more efficient. So then we'll act so we expect when we call the FAQ method, we should get a view returned back to us. Now, this isn't probably the world's greatest unit test, because as long as the method returns any view at all, the unit test is going to pass. We probably want to check that not only did we get a view back, but that that view is called FAQ. If we get back the about view, right now the unit test would actually pass. As long as we're getting something back, this should be a passing test. And is not an action result. Unit test, it returns void. So now we want to run our FAQ test. I'll just right click and say run. And our test has passed. So when we call the FAQ method of the controller, we are getting a result object back that is of type view result. So I'm going to rerun our code coverage. Like I said, unfortunately, there's no way to refresh this. I have to go through the process again, go to tools and analyze and all tests. It builds and runs the tests all over again. And then I have to expand again. There's nothing. Okay. So by adding that method, our code coverage in the controller went from 80 some odd percent to 93%. And our FAQ method, which previously had 0 blocks of code coverage, now has all 3 blocks of code covered, and it's at 100%. And that red highlighting that we saw earlier, turn my highlighting back on, it's now blue. So it's telling us we're covered in this block. So the reason that these are yellow, we look at our test for a So for these methods, we probably should actually have 2 unit tests. One test that's checking what's in the view bag, and the other test that's checking that a view actually got returned. Those things. That's why we've got some yellow here. And even though we've covered most of the code blocks, there's still in each one isn't being checked. So we won't always get to fully 100% code coverage, but we want to be getting close, at least in the 90s, is what we would ideally like to do. So this tool is pretty helpful along with the color coding in letting us know how much of our code is properly unit tested. This is also going to help us if we go then and change that controller. We can make sure that we're not breaking these existing methods which are properly tested and working. Anybody have questions so far? Okay, so what we want to do is we can't continue on into next class, is we want to get as close as possible as we can to unit testing our albums controller, which right now has 210 blocks of uncovered code. Right? Our code coverage is 0. So if we look inside every method at all. So we want a unit test, but we also want to include to use mock data so that we're divorcing our methods from the integration with the database. So we're going to use some in-memory fake data instead while we're doing this. Okay, so let's look at how many methods we've got here. So we've got 2 versions of create, right? Here's our get, here's our post, 1, 2 versions of delete that shows the record and asks for a confirmation, and this is what actually deletes it. So that's 4 methods, 5. We're going to ignore dispose. We're probably going to get rid of that one. Of edit, 6, 7, and index. So there's 8 methods in the controller that are used to perform create, read, update, and delete. So we're probably going to need, I would ballpark it, somewhere between 20 and 25 unit tests in order to get either 100% or close to 100% coverage in this controller. Okay, so what did I say there? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So 8 methods. Okay, let's see. Okay, here's what we're going to do. I'm going to give you guys, so Siobhan, Michael, your table. I want you to make a list for this version of create. What unit tests, you don't have to write the code, just identify what tests are we going to need to get full code coverage in the create get method. Okay. You two, okay, who are sitting by yourselves, you can work your own. You're going to make a list for the post version of create. Okay. What you, again, don't write the code, just make a list in order to get code coverage in that method. Okay. Keon and Dylan, you guys are going to do the delete get. Okay. What unit tests do we need? Tuna, Puneet, Nikhil, you guys are going to do the delete confirm. Okay. Yes. Mark and Ken, details. What unit tests do we need? The 5 of you, just in your group, you're going to do the edit, the HTTP post version. Okay. What you need, you guys are going to do the get edit method, and the 3 of you make a list on what unit tests are we going to need. So we'll put all that list together when we're done, and then we know what unit tests we're going to have to write in order to get close to 100% code coverage in here. And we won't write all of these tests today, but we'll start writing them today. So I'm going to give you maybe 5 minutes, 5 or 10 minutes to talk about it, make a list as a group. You guys are doing the edit, the get method for edit.
Just see where it actually is in album of ID. Based on your whole albums database. All the data like yeah. Yeah,
Sorry?
The Roslyn CSC error file.
In the NuGet package manager. So go to package manager console, tools, NuGet package manager. So tools, NuGet package manager console.
Yeah.
Did you notice that? I'm like, I respect it. I respect it. What I want, but I respect it. I respect it. I believe they should be cooking. For a great video. For an amazing video. Good call. Did that. That's so much.
Did you apply the alcohol? Sort of. Get ready now.
Okay.
Here, I asked you.
Okay, as long as you know.
Are we doing the one or the post one?
You're doing post.
The post, okay.
Why is it so hard to get back?
We were ready.
You guys have your list?
Yeah.
We're working on it, you got your list? No, okay. Time, you got your list? Got your list? Pretty good idea. Okay. Yeah. You guys have your list?
Yeah.
All right.
Give you a couple more minutes. Some lists are going to be a little longer than others. Some of the methods, others. In a couple minutes, I'll compile a list on Blackboard, and then that'll give our work to do. The rest of this class and in the next class is to write those unit tests and figure out how do we get them to run. And you guys will have all the tests you need to unit test for your project. Control folders. You don't need to do it in both. Okay, so I know you guys are still finishing up, so just keep going. I'm going to start to compile a list, and I'll put them up here. Okay, so I'm going to ask the group that's got the first set of unit tests for create the get method. If we pull up that method here. So what tests are we going to need in order to properly unit test this method? Two of those. So should we write? So actually, this is an interesting question with unit testing. If we're going to check two of those, should we have one unit test that checks both of those? Or should we have a separate unit test for each view bag value? Which do you think would make more sense? Okay, typically, yes, unit tests typically should assert one and only one thing, right? So that if we have one of the lists and not the other, the idea is we're testing those in isolation. Right. So to say that if we wrote it as one test, because then what do we do if we have one of those view bags correct and the other one is incorrect? Right? It doesn't, because then our unit test fails, but we don't necessarily know what's wrong. So yeah, exactly, Ken. It's better to test each one of them. So we probably want two separate unit tests for this, one for each view bag element. Okay. Yep. Okay. Right. So, all right. So we'll want 3 unit tests. There's actually 3 lines of code in that method, but to get each one of these to a blue state, we're actually testing every one of those things independently. All right. Okay, what about the post? What things do we want to test here?
So the first I'm going to test is model state.
Okay. If the model state is not null, what happens in the code? Well, let's just have a look. Yeah, right. So in that case, we need to make sure, right, that we're saving, right? So if our model isn't null, we want to create a new record. Okay. So we want to test. All right. What about our delete get? What do we need there? How many tests? 6. Okay. Let's have a look at our method. Okay. So what things do we need to test? Wrong spot. Okay. So what happens when we call delete, but we don't pass in any album ID? Okay. Yeah. What else? Okay. Yeah. So two different scenarios, right? No ID, or we get ID negative 300, which doesn't exist. So we have to unit test both of those scenarios because both of those could happen. Okay. Okay. Right. So valid ID returns album. Yep. Okay. That we can probably do those two things in one test. Actually, we do want to test them, but one test will actually take care of both of them, make sure both of those are working. Yeah. Yep. So again, that's going to be part of this test, right? So if we can test it by passing in an invalid ID and making sure that we get an error back. So that'll be in part of that test. Right. All right. So yeah, we do want to test so we can combine a couple of those. A couple of the things will actually be built in with a single test. Those. All right. Thanks, guys. What about the delete confirmed? What unit test do we need? Yep. So those same two checks for both the get and post. Right? The ID is not null. The valid ID returns a correct album. Anything else? What actually happens in this method? What's the main purpose of that delete confirmed method? And we need to test. Right. We need to test, does delete work, right? If we have a list of mock albums and we delete album ID 1, we then need to look through the list of albums and make sure that album doesn't exist anymore. So we need to test the core functionality of that method. Okay, details, what test do we need?
It'll be similar to the delete style.
Yep.
We just check we also have to make sure that the valid ID and that sort of coincides.
So if the ID is null on details, it should throw an error. If the ID isn't found, it should throw an error. If a valid ID is passed in, it should return an object with that matches that ID. Okay. What about our edit get method? What did you guys have for unit tests? Oh, you had. Yep. Okay, sorry, did I give you guys, I gave you post? Okay, sorry, I'm out of order. Okay, sorry, I was in the wrong spot. Okay, carry on. Okay. So what happens if the model is valid? Okay, yep. What if the model is invalid? Right. Right, if we're staying on the same page, we need to check the view bag values. So two separate unit tests for that in that case. This is maybe the most complicated scenario. Got quite a few unit tests. Okay. What about the index method? Okay. Let's look at the index method for a second. It's not so much the artist and the genre. What data are we selecting here? Right, it's when we're checking that we have album data. And what would be the other thing we're checking? So that one's fairly simple, right? Do we get the right view? Do we have album data? So then the last one is the edit get. We'll just make a list here, and then we'll have a break. So
first we check the ID.
yep.
Sure that object is correctly that equals the album is null, return HTTP null.
So we have an ID.
Make sure the artist, UBAG, artist ID, and genre ID.
All right, you're on the right track, right? We want to populate the view bag objects if it's valid. So basically 5 tests here, 2 for the view bag, and then the 3 scenarios. No ID, invalid ID, valid ID. We need to check each one of those scenarios because all of those are in the controller method.
After that, after the
Okay. So really, in order to fully test it, we should have 6 unit tests. 3 different scenarios about IDs. And then when we have a valid ID, Did we get the right object? Do we have the two view bags populated properly? Did the right page load? So there's 4 things we're checking when we have a valid ID. All right, so there's our kind of our list of unit tests. Now, I know that seems fairly daunting, but if you look under the edit, the details, and the delete, about half the unit tests are simply checking those 3 scenarios, right? Over and over again. ID is null, ID is invalid, ID is valid. So those unit tests will be pretty easy to repeat for edit, delete, and details because they're the same. So then we can focus on the other things. All right, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to stop our video stream now. Let's take a 15-minute break. Okay, we'll come back at 4:40, and then we'll maybe start down here with index, and we'll see. I mean, basically, I want to have our unit test done by the end of next week. So however many we get done this week, that's fine. We'll resume with writing more unit tests next week. Okay, and the other piece we're going to have to figure out is how does the whole mock data, how does this piece fit into it? Because again, we want to do this, but we need to divorce the database from our application for the purpose of unit testing. Okay? We'll come back in 15 minutes.